In September 1915, a ship crossed the Atlantic carrying some of the most important passengers in the world. They were not generals. They carried no military plans or weapons. They were bankers and government officials from Britain and France. And they had come to New York because the Allied war effort was developing a problem that artillery could not solve. They were running out of ways to pay America. Every day, British and French agents ordered American wheat, steel, cotton, trucks, chemicals, and weapons. The goods crossed the Atlantic, but the money moved in the opposite direction so quickly that the old system began to crack. Britain still controlled the world's largest empire. Yet after barely 1 year of war, British and French officials had arrived in a neutral country to ask private bankers for $500 million. And standing between them and financial failure was not the American government. It was the House of Morgan. The deal that followed became the largest foreign loan Wall Street had ever arranged. Officially, it was a commercial transaction. In practice, it helped Britain and France keep buying the supplies that kept their armies in the field. But it also created a darker question. Once American banks, factories, and investors had hundreds of millions of dollars tied to an Allied victory, could the United States still remain truly neutral? When Europe entered the war in August 1914, nearly every government expected a short conflict. Instead, the armies became trapped in a vast industrial siege. Millions of men required food, uniforms, shells, rifles, railway equipment, and medical supplies. Battles consumed ammunition faster than entire nations could replace it. Britain and France had large economies, but they could not manufacture everything at the speed the war demanded. They turned increasingly toward the United States, one of the few major industrial powers still outside the conflict. That decision transformed American trade. By the middle of 1915, a State Department memorandum estimated that American exports had exceeded imports by nearly $1 billion in only 7 months. Officials expected the surplus for the full year to reach roughly $2.5 billion. American factories were selling more than Europe could easily pay for. At first, the Allies covered the gap with gold, and by selling American securities they already owned. But neither supply was unlimited. Shipping too much gold would weaken their currencies. Selling their American investments could buy time, but eventually those assets would run out. If that happened, Allied orders would slow, and Washington feared the consequences would spread through American mills, farms, railways, and factories. Europe needed American goods. America needed European buyers. Both sides now required a financial bridge between them. That bridge was already being built by J.P. Morgan and Company. The J.P. Morgan behind the 1915 loan was not the famous financier who created U.S. Steel and helped rescue the American banking system. John Pierpont Morgan had died in 1913. The man now leading the firm was his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack. He inherited a private network stretching through New York, London, and Paris, built over decades of financing railroads, governments, and industrial corporations. In January 1915, the British government appointed J.P. Morgan and Company as its principal purchasing agent in the United States. France soon developed a similar arrangement. Morgan created an export department that coordinated orders, inspected suppliers, arranged insurance, and organized shipments across the Atlantic. At its peak, this operation handled as much as $10 million in goods per day. By the end of the war, the firm had placed more than $3 billion in contracts with American suppliers. Morgan had become the financial and logistical center of the Allied supply system in America. That position also created an obvious conflict. Morgan earned commissions when Allied purchases increased. American manufacturers earned profits when the war continued. Banks benefited when Europe borrowed. The Allies needed Morgan, but Morgan and a growing section of the American economy were also benefiting from the Allies. By the summer of 1915, that system faced its greatest test. President Woodrow Wilson had declared the United States neutral. Early in the war, his administration discouraged American bankers from making direct loans to belligerent governments, arguing that war loans violated the spirit of neutrality. But trade credits were harder to reject. If an American company could legally sell food or steel to Britain, could an American bank finance the purchase? By 1915, the administration's position was shifting. Secretary of State Robert Lansing warned Wilson that refusing large foreign loans could damage American prosperity. Europe would eventually exhaust its gold and American securities. Without credit, Allied purchases would collapse. Lansing described the choice in brutally practical terms: allow American capital to finance Europe or risk idle factories, unemployment and financial disorder at home. Neutrality was colliding with economics. There was another imbalance. Britain's navy controlled the Atlantic and blockaded Germany. In theory, American companies could trade with both sides. In reality, British sea power meant that most large-scale trade flowed toward the Allies. So when the Anglo-French Financial Commission arrived in September, it entered a country that remained neutral in law but was becoming allied in commerce. Led by Lord Reading, the delegation had one objective: persuade American finance to absorb a loan larger than anything Wall Street had previously attempted. Morgan now had to turn Europe's war debt into an investment Americans would buy. The final structure was enormous. Britain and France would jointly borrow $500 million. Each government would receive half. The bonds paid 5% interest and matured after 5 years. They were offered to the public at $98 for every $100 of face value. But the Allies did not receive the full $500 million. Morgan's underwriting syndicate took the bonds at 96, producing approximately $480 million in cash. In return, the syndicate accepted the risk of distributing the bonds to investors. The obligation was joint and several. Britain and France were both responsible for repayment. To an American buyer, the credit of two major empires stood behind the same security. Morgan then assembled an extraordinary distribution network. Around 2,200 banks, brokers, and investment houses helped place the bonds across the United States. Denominations began as low as $100, allowing the loan to reach beyond a small circle of New York financiers. This was more than a negotiation. It was a national sales campaign. Supporters presented the bonds as a secure investment and argued that the money would settle trade balances and pay for goods purchased in America. Critics saw the transaction differently. Money used for food, transport, and commercial imports could free other Allied funds for shells and weapons. Financially, money is interchangeable. That made the line between a trade loan and a war loan almost impossible to defend. Opposition appeared immediately. German-American organizations, pacifists, and critics of Wall Street argued that the loan favored one side in a war America had promised to avoid. Some banks refused to participate. Others feared angry depositors or political backlash. The loan also revealed the limits of Morgan's power. The underwriting syndicate subscribed to the issue, guaranteeing the Allies their money, but selling every bond to the public proved more difficult. Some securities remained with participating banks, and prices weakened after the launch. The deal was both a success and a warning. Britain and France received about $480 million in usable cash. The money flowed through the Allied purchasing system. But the difficult public sale warned that investors would not finance unlimited foreign borrowing on reputation alone. For the moment, the financial bridge held. Farms supplied food, steel mills expanded, chemical companies, locomotive builders, and arms manufacturers accepted more orders. The Allies gained time and purchasing power. And America gained something even more important: leverage. Before the war, the United States had depended heavily on European capital. London financed trade across the world, and American companies often looked east for money. Now Europe was selling assets, shipping gold, and borrowing from New York. The center of financial gravity had started to move. The question is, did Morgan pull America into the war? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. By 1917, American banks and investors had enormous financial exposure to Britain and France. American factories had reorganized around Allied demand. An Allied defeat threatened defaults, cancelled orders, and a severe economic shock. That gave Wall Street a clear preference. But preference is not proof that bankers controlled American foreign policy. The United States entered the war after Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and after the Zimmermann telegram revealed a German proposal for an alliance with Mexico. Those events changed public opinion and gave Wilson direct national security reasons to ask Congress for war. The Morgan loan did not secretly force America into the trenches. What it did was change the environment in which neutrality operated. After 1915, an Allied collapse no longer represented a distant European outcome. It threatened American banks, investors, exporters, and jobs. The loan connected American prosperity to the survival of governments already fighting Germany. That connection mattered even without a conspiracy. Morgan did not need to order Washington into war. Private finance had already made the Atlantic economy lean heavily toward one side. And once that happened, political neutrality became harder to separate from financial self-interest. The Anglo-French Loan matured in 1920. Britain and France each arranged repayment of their half. But the world that had produced the loan was already gone. London emerged from the war deeply indebted. The United States emerged as the leading creditor power. The dollar had not fully replaced sterling, but New York had proved it could mobilize capital on a scale once associated with London. The loan also changed the reputation of the House of Morgan. To supporters, the firm had performed a historic financial operation. It connected American capital, industrial capacity, and Allied demand when governments could not build the system quickly enough. To critics, Morgan had shown how a private bank could gain extraordinary influence over national policy. It earned money from Allied purchases, organized Allied credit, and helped create an American economic stake in a foreign war. Both interpretations contain part of the truth. Britain and France did not win the First World War because of one bond issue, but the loan kept a vital purchasing system operating when the Allies could no longer rely only on gold and asset sales. More importantly, it marked a transfer of power. Europe arrived in New York as a borrower. Wall Street decided the terms. American investors supplied the capital. American factories supplied the goods. The United States still called itself neutral, but its money had already chosen a direction. That is the real legacy of the 1915 loan. It revealed that modern wars depend on more than soldiers, weapons, and territory. They depend on credit. And sometimes, before a country enters a war with its army, it enters through its banks. Subscribe to Mazuma Media so you know how finance shaped history and vice versa.